Friday afternoon at Highland Valley High School was no different than usual. Golden sunlight streamed through the auditorium's tall windows, casting a soft glow over the rows of faded red velvet seats. On stage, the spotlight was being tested one last time and microphones adjusted. Giggles, the click of high heels, and teachers' hurried instructions filled the air as everyone prepared for Talent Night's final rehearsal, the school's annual arts showcase. Amid the excited crowd, no one noticed Emily Carter, a petite 13-year-old girl in a plain school dress, standing quietly behind the stage curtain. She clutched an old violin with peeling varnish and a neck held together by a piece of yellowed tape. Emily had no close friends at school. She was someone people knew of, but not someone they knew. They knew she was Mr. Carter's daughter, the man who cleaned the auditorium. They had seen her at the end of the day, when most students had gone home, silently collecting trash and mopping floors alongside her father. Perhaps that's why, when the music teacher, Ms. Thompson, squinted at the performance list and made a half-joking remark, "Why don't we let Emily Carter play a piece? She's always hanging around the music room anyway." The packed rehearsal room fell silent for a few seconds, then burst into laughter. Some students clapped mockingly, as if the idea was a joke highlight. Standing behind the curtain, Emily heard every word. She wasn't angry. She was used to looking like that, judging a child who didn't seem to belong. But this time something felt different inside her. Not a tearful hurt, just a quiet choke in her throat. A feeling of being dragged into the light, not to be recognized, but to be exposed. Then her name was called over the microphone, "Emily Carter, please come to the stage." Every head in the auditorium turned toward the wings, where Emily stood, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She didn't step forward to prove anything. She didn't think she'd win. She just didn't want to step back anymore. Emily's footsteps echoed softly on the wooden stage, quiet but precise. Her violin trembled in her hands, not from fear, but because after years of careful upkeep, she knew it couldn't survive one more fall. It was a gift from her father. He had found it in a dusty storage room and spent 2 weeks repairing it, tuning it and polishing off years of grime with his hands, and, standing center stage, the spotlight hit Emily directly in the eyes, obscuring every face watching her. But she didn't need to see them. They didn't believe in her. An older student whispered, "Is she playing a piece or doing a comedy act?" Then came a familiar voice, cold and hollow from the audience. "Go on, Emily. We're very curious." It was Ms. Thompson. The same condescending smile. Emily didn't respond. She raised her bow, her left arm slightly shaking, but her eyes steady. At that moment, it was just her, the violin, and a strange silence creeping across the room like mist. And when the first string hummed, something began to change. The laughter stopped. The crowded hall suddenly felt tight and quiet. The first notes emerged raw, rough, but aching and deep. This wasn't music learned from a book. It was the voice from the deepest part of a 13-year-old girl who had grown up silently. The sound of the violin, soft and unpretentious, held something no one could look away from. It wasn't perfect. The first note wavered. One string came in half a second late. But soon it tapped into something tangible, human, and sorrowful. As if each note sliced through memories Emily had never dared speak. The whispers faded. The eyes that once saw her as a joke didn't know where to look now. Some students furrowed their brows not in annoyance, but because they didn't understand why their throats were tight. Ms. Thompson, the teacher who once laughed at the taped-up violin, now clutched the armrest. She stared at Emily, her gaze no longer mocking, but the confusion of someone realizing they might have been entirely wrong. Emily saw none of it. Her eyes were closed. She saw her father, who had spent his life scrubbing walls that no one remembered. She saw the small room full of old music books, scratched CDs, and a radio playing softly at midnight so she could practice without waking the neighbors. She saw herself dreaming each night of playing a song before hundreds, constantly waking before the first bow stroke. And now that dream wasn't a dream anymore. The auditorium sound was absolute. No hum from the AC, no creak of chairs. Only the violin slipped in, rising, and suddenly soared like wind rushing past the stone walls of prejudice. And it didn't ask permission. Emily played like she had nothing left to lose, as if this piece, if not complete, would leave her a forgotten shadow pitied or dismissed. And it was that desperation that made her music impossible to ignore. A 10th grade girl in the front row covered her mouth. Her boyfriend gently touched her chair back, but dared not move, as if the slightest action might shatter the moment. The principal, who had checked his watch earlier, now sat upright, eyes locked on the stage. Behind the curtain, Mr. Carter, Emily's father, stood still. His hand still held the mop. But he wasn't cleaning. His eyes peeked through the slit in the curtain, as if afraid blinking might erase this moment. In those hands, worn raw by scrubbing, something was shimmering, fragile and sacred. Love, pride, and fear that his daughter would face an unjust world again. But this time, he knew she was no longer alone. When the final note rang out, a low, long tone dry like a gasp, after a long run, Emily stopped. She opened her eyes, lowered her violin. Her body was still tense like a bowstring. And then, silence. No one moved. No coughs, no whispers, no claps. The air felt held tight by an invisible hand. Someone wanted to clap but didn't want to be first. Until a soft sound broke through. Clap. One person clapped. Then another. Then an entire row. And within 3 seconds the whole auditorium erupted. Applause no longer timid but thunderous. Cheers. Shouts. Emily remained still. No smile. No tears. Just breathing. Her heartbeat pounded against her chest, but she didn't let herself collapse. She had waited for this moment too long, and now it was hers. The applause didn't stop. Emily stood at center stage, the violin still in her hand like an extension of her body. But now it didn't feel heavy anymore. A 13-year-old girl had just made a room full of people who never believed in her rise to their feet like they had witnessed something miraculous. And maybe it truly was a miracle. Just as Emily was about to step back behind the stage, only wanting to run into her father's arms, a sudden movement at the back of the auditorium caught everyone's attention. A man was rising to his feet, unlike the random applause. Unlike the reaction of an emotional parent, this man stood up slowly, deliberately, as if he knew his presence would change everything. A navy blue suit, crisp white shirt collar, and gleaming leather shoes reflecting the ceiling lights. Salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, a sharply defined face, and eyes fixed on the stage, on Emily unblinking. The room gradually fell quiet. The clapping slowed, then stopped entirely, not because someone signaled it, but because everyone sensed something different had just begun. Ms. Thompson, standing at stage right, tilted her head and squinted. She murmured almost in disbelief, "No way. That's—" The man strolled toward the stage, each steady step echoing clearly on the wooden floor like the tick of fate. No one asked who he was. No one dared speak. Breaths were caught in throats. Finally, as he stood in front of the stage, he looked up at Emily and spoke in a calm, resonant voice. "My name is Harrison Blake, And that was enough. A wave of murmurs surged through the auditorium like a current. A girl in the second row gasped Blake. As in, Blake Conservatory. A math teacher nearly dropped his pen. Principal Sterling, who had been checking his watch just 10 minutes earlier, suddenly shot up, as if called upon in a surprise exam. Ms. Thompson stepped back, her hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Blake, are you here?" Harrison Blake, renowned violinist, international award winner, former New York Symphony Orchestra conductor and founder of the most prestigious music academy on the East Coast, had just watched Emily's entire performance, and he hadn't looked away for a single second. He gave a slight nod to Ms. Thompson, then turned to Emily. "I came here today to evaluate whether this school's art program was worth supporting. I was planning to leave after 15 minutes, but then I heard someone tuning their violin backstage. At first I thought it was a recording, but then you started playing." His gaze settled on the instrument in Emily's hands, old chipped, barely held together with faded grey duct tape. "I stood there, unable to move, and when you played that final note, I knew what I had to do." The room fell still. Emily stood frozen, the light breeze from the air conditioning gently rustling her bangs. She looked down at him, not speaking, not understanding, only feeling her heart pounding so hard it could burst. Blake took a breath. "I will sponsor all your application costs. Tuition, preparatory training, a new instrument, everything. If you want to pursue music, I'll open the first door." A soft gasp rose from someone in the crowd. As for Emily, she could hardly believe her ears. Her father, Mr. Carter, stepped forward slightly from backstage, mouth parting as if to object, but he stood there frozen. Ms. Thompson was the first to break the silence. "Sir, with all due respect, she's never had formal training. She's never been in the system." Blake turned his head, eyes sharp as a blade, but his voice remained gentle. "That's exactly why her talent is even more valuable." He turned back to Emily, his gaze sincere. "I've heard hundreds of technically perfect performances, but today, for the first time in years, I heard a soul, not just a piece of music." Emily tried to speak, but no words came out. She only shook her head slightly, almost reflexively. I'm not qualified. I'm just—" Blake smiled. "You are Emily Carter, and today you've made me believe that music has never been a privilege reserved for the wealthy." After Mr. Harrison Blake's offer, the previously noisy room fell into another kind of silence. A deeper awe, more profound than sound. No one dared laugh anymore, no one dared scoff, because now they all realized they hadn't just mocked a little girl. They had mocked a kind of music that could move one of the most powerful figures in the industry to his feet. Emily remained frozen in place. She didn't know how to react. Her hands were drenched in sweat, but her eyes never left the man holding a ticket to another world. And then quiet footsteps echoed from the wings. It was her father, Mr. Carter. He didn't come too close, didn't say a word, just looked at his daughter with eyes filled with emotion, as if silently asking, "Are you ready?" Emily looked at him. She nodded. 3 hours later, a sleek black car pulled up behind Highland Valley High School. The driver, in a tailored suit, stepped out and opened the door without a word. Emily sat in the back, clutching her old violin like a lifeline. Beside her was her father, trying to stay calm, though his eyes kept darting to the window as if afraid that one blink might make the moment disappear. Harrison Blake sat across from them, entirely composed. "We're not going to my office," he said. "We're going to my home, or more precisely, what I call the House of Music." Emily turned to him, stunned. The car turned onto a cobblestone path flanked by tall maple trees. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the leaves like golden honey, and then before them appeared a pristine white building, grey-tiled roof, soaring windows with arched frames like a classical symphony cast in architecture. Blake Conservatory of Music. The gold-plated letters shimmered in the sunset like a whispered invitation. Emily held her breath. She had never seen a place like this, not in movies or dreams. The car stopped at the steps. The driver opened the door. Harrison Blake stepped out, first turned, and offered his hand to Emily. "You don't need to be ready. You only need to be brave enough to walk in." Emily looked at her father one last time. He nodded, not with pressure, not with fear, but with a small, steady motion, as if to say, "You don't have to belong there. Just make that place belong to you." The main hall of the conservatory looked like a miniature opera house. Polished mahogany floors, ceilings touching the rafters, walls lined with portraits of musical legends. Every step Emily took echoed gently but firmly, like she was entering a new chapter of her life. A large door opened to reveal a small concert hall where a grand piano stood under a spotlight from the ceiling like a stage on Broadway. Harrison turned to her. "We don't offer scholarships out of pity. We offer them based on the only thing that matters here, music." He handed her a sheet of music-heavy paper, crisp print full of complex symbols Emily had never formally studied. She looked at him uncertain. I don't know how to play this sheet music." Blake didn't smile. He wasn't upset either. "Good. Then do what you did before, tell a story." "In your language." Emily nodded. She sat on a single chair and adjusted her posture. The violin in her hands was old, worn, and out of place in this luxurious room. But when she drew the bow, the sound rang out, not weak, not clumsy. It was the voice of a soul once stifled, now free. The notes rose like waves crashing against walls of silence, making the air vibrate. Harrison Blake said nothing, but in his eyes a light had been lit. "This is the one. This is the one I've been searching for." When the final note lingered, a long, solemn echo, like a farewell unspoken. Emily lowered her bow. There was no applause, no hurried praise, just silence. But this time, not the silence of doubt or disdain, it was the silence of absolute respect. Harrison Blake hadn't moved the entire time, arms folded, eyes piercing through the violin to the core of the girl's spirit. Then he nodded, slowly, clearly. "You didn't play like a student. You played like a witness." Emily was puzzled. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but her heart knew. She had been recognized. Footsteps clicked from behind. A tall woman in a black dress entered. Graceful, poised, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes sharp yet discerning. Dr. Miranda Hale, director of Blake Conservatory. She approached Harrison Blake, exchanged a subtle glance, then looked straight at Emily. "Daniel told me about you, but what I just heard surpassed everything he said." Emily swallowed hard. She had never stood before anyone with such authority. Miranda stepped closer and spoke in a voice that was both cold and warm. "We'd like to offer you an official place at the conservatory. Immediately." Emily's heart nearly stopped. A full scholarship, Miranda continued, covering tuition, housing, meals, instruments, and a personal coach. A space opened in Emily's mind, not from disbelief, but because the first thing that came to her wasn't the music or the stage lights. It was the image of her father, Mr. Carter, standing in the basement janitor's room at school, folding rags with his cracked hands. She turned to look at him. He stood near the entrance, saying nothing. His arms hung by his sides, his back slightly hunched, and his eyes glistened like glass touched by sunlight. "I can't go alone," she said softly, then looked up at the director. "I can't leave my father behind." Miranda furrowed her brow. You don't need to worry about that right now. Your future, but he is my present. Emily interrupted, her voice not loud, but carrying something that made the entire room pause. She turned fully toward her father and stepped closer. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't look away. You've always cleaned up everything behind me, so I could walk forward without fear. But if I go too far without you, then where am I going, Harrison? Blake pressed his lips together. Mr. Carter stepped forward, placing his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Emily, he said, his voice trembling but steady, you've spent your childhood watching me bow my head for others. Now, it's time I lift my head for you. He turned to Harrison. If this girl needs a guardian, I'm willing to work on campus. Clean, guard the instrument room. Anything, just let me stay close to her. Miranda looked at him. Something shifted in her eyes. Harrison gave her a silent nod, a quiet signal. Then, it's settled, Miranda said, her tone softening. Mr. Carter, we have a position in the internal maintenance team. If you accept it, the conservatory will arrange your accommodation. And from today, Emily will be an official student. Emily looked up at her father, unable to hide her emotion. I get to study here, not just study, Emily. Harrison, Blake said, you will grow, you will shine, and you will ensure no one ever dares judge an artist by their worn-out shoes. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile after a long, long day. She turned to Miranda with no more hesitation. I accept. The dormitory at Blake Conservatory was unlike any place Emily had ever known. Each room was equipped with specialized soundproofing. The polished wooden floors, gleamed walls, adorned with portraits of renowned musicians, and balconies overlooked a classical garden, with a fountain carved with angelic figures. The communal dining hall wasn't a place for lining up with plastic trays. It was a serene space where the clink of cutlery against porcelain was softer than a whisper. Everything was quiet, beautiful, but eerily unfamiliar. Emily lay on her new bed, the white cotton blanket smoother than any she had ever used. But she couldn't sleep. She missed the stains on the walls of their old rented room, missed the creak of her father adjusting the old heater each night, even missed the smell of ink from the mop bucket she used to despise. Above all, she felt she didn't belong here. On her first day of class, Emily wore the conservatory uniform, a white shirt, blue skirt, and burgundy tie. Everything fit perfectly, but it didn't make her feel any less out of place. When she entered the advanced violin class, the initial gazes weren't of admiration. They were skeptical. That's the new scholarship student, right? A blonde girl whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. Heard she's never had formal training. Plays by instinct. Yeah, and her dad's a janitor. Weird. Emily heard every word. She sat in the back row, her violin, the same old chipped one from her father, rested silently in its case as if it felt out of place. Professor Callahan entered the room. He was renowned in classical music, strict, precise, and intolerant of sentimentality. His presence was like a metronome, steady, unwavering, never offbeat. Emily Carter, he looked at the roster, then up. Is that you? Emily stood up. Callahan examined her as if assessing an unfinished composition. We don't grade based on sympathy. Please perform any piece, using your violin. Emily nodded and stepped forward. A student whispered, she's still using that old violin. She opened the case, placed the violin on her shoulder, closed her eyes, then played. The melody rose, not as dazzling as her first performance at Highland Valley, but deep, quiet, and layered. Not to impress, but to say I'm still here. Callahan showed no emotion. When she finished, he said, you play with emotion. That's something that can't be taught. Emily held her breath. But technique needs to be retaught from the beginning. A few chuckles echoed from the back. Callahan extended his hand. You'll start with the foundational technique class every morning at 6 o'clock. If you don't attend consistently, the conservatory doesn't keep unserious students. Emily left the class, not angry, not afraid, just feeling something familiar returned, and she had to start from zero again. But this time not in the dark, but under glaring lights, where everyone watched, waiting to see her stumble. In the days that followed, Emily began a grueling training regimen. 6 a.m. finger exercises, bowing in rhythm, adjusting each note precisely. Noon studying music theory and classical chord structures. Evening practicing concerto passages that her peers had learned since they were 8. Her hands blistered, her back ached. Some nights she fell asleep at the practice desk. But every time Emily felt exhausted and ready to give up, she would remember the look in her father's eyes that day in the auditorium and the deep, calm voice of Harrison Blake. You don't need to be ready. You need to dare to step in. And so Emily didn't back down. She didn't feel like she was making fast progress. But then her classmates started to notice. One day after finishing a practice session, the blonde girl who once whispered insults gave a subtle nod as Emily walked out of the classroom. Professor Callahan didn't praise her, but he gave a slight nod for the first time, the gesture only understood by those who had endured his silence for weeks. It meant you're on the right track. In May, Blake Conservatory entered its most crucial time of the year, the annual showcase, a performance event gathering the Academy's finest talents to perform in front of judges, sponsors, and representatives from international music institutions. It wasn't just a performance, it was a moment to be seen. A spot in the showcase meant an opportunity to be invited to conservatories in Vienna, Berlin, and New York. Contracts, scholarships, and sometimes a career. Emily never thought she would be selected. She had only been there for less than 3 months. But that afternoon, while wiping off sweat after an early morning practice, she received a message from the office, Emily Carter. Confirmed for showcase performance. Prepare your piece within 10 days. She read it again and again, eyes unblinking. Her heart pounded. 10 days. Not long, but enough time to change the world. That night, Emily found her father. He was cleaning the instrument storage room behind the main hall. Dad, I got selected for the showcase. Mr. Carter looked at her, put down his cloth and stepped closer. Are you nervous? Yes. Good. Because if you're not nervous, it means you don't care. Emily smiled, and he smiled back, a rare shared smile that both understood this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of their most significant test. The performance day arrived sooner than expected. The Academy's main concert hall glowed brightly. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. Every seat was labeled with the names of sponsors, visiting judges, and representatives from international academies. Emily stood backstage wearing a simple black dress provided by the Academy. Her violin, still the old one, had been retuned and reinforced. She refused to replace it. I'll play with what brought me here, she told her father, not to prove anything but to give thanks. When her name was called, Emily walked out. The spotlight came down. All voices fell silent. And then she saw him. 3rd row, right side. Sitting there was a middle-aged man in a dark brown suit, arms crossed, gaze sharp as a blade, Mr. Barnes, her old music teacher from Highland Valley. The man who smirked when she clutched her battered violin in the music room. The man who once said a janitor's daughter should learn to keep quiet, not meddle with art. He didn't take his eyes off her. But this time it wasn't a gaze of certainty. Emily didn't flinch. She lifted her head, straightened her back, placed the violin on her shoulder, closed her eyes. There was no MC, no introduction, no need for any opening lines. The music began soft as the first breath of dawn. Then it spread quickly like a wave. She didn't play with technical showmanship. She didn't try to impress. She told her whole story, sweeping floors while eavesdropping on melodies, stepping onto a stage as a joke and burning herself out, practicing long after class. Each note was a cut. Each section was a scar. Each rhythm was a declaration: I no longer stand in the shadows. When the final note sounded, a long, steady, powerful, Emily lowered her violin. No bow, no expectations, but the audience stood up. All of them. The applause thundered. There were whistles and cries of bravo from the French Academy's representative. And Mr. Barnes still sat. Emily looked directly at him, and then he nodded, a slow nod, not reluctant, a nod like someone finally accepting a truth they once denied. After the performance, as Emily exited the stage, Harrison Blake waited in the hallway. He said no words of praise. He just placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "Well done, but this is only your first piece. The next chapters are yours to write." After the showcase night, everything changed. Not suddenly. There were no fanfares, just glances from those who used to ignore her now linger a few seconds longer. Just whispers that slowly turned into quiet greetings in the hallway. Emily didn't need to be famous. She just wanted to be seen for who she truly was. On the first morning after the showcase, a letter was quietly placed on her desk. On the envelope, Emily Carter. Inside, an invitation from the Vienna National Conservatory of Music, offering her a short-term summer program reserved for students who had exceeded conventional standards through a rare and extraordinary soul. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. But it was real. She brought the letter to find her father. Mr. Carter was watering plants in the Academy's courtyard, a job he had taken since day one to stay close to his daughter. When Emily handed him the letter, he read it silently, his hands trembling non-stop. After a moment he looked up, eyes glassy red, but his lips smiling like the day she first learned to walk. "I always knew," he said softly, "but I never thought I'd love to see it." Life at the Academy continued, lessons, practice, sonatas, and concertos woven into each heartbeat. But Emily was no longer just the scholarship girl. She was mentioned in faculty meetings, invited to assist new students, nominated by professors for exchange programs. One late autumn afternoon, with sunlight slanting through the windows of the rehearsal room, Harrison Blake dropped by. He didn't talk much when he visited, but when he did, it always meant something. That day he watched her rehearse, then said without turning his head, "You've come a long way, Emily. But never forget why you started." She paused and looked up as if to ask. But he was already gone, leaving behind a resonance like a note that hadn't yet finished ringing. The day Emily left the Academy for Vienna, the entire dorm came to see her off. Those who once ignored her now brought pastries, scarves, and warm wishes she never thought she'd receive. Miranda Hale, the Academy's director, also came not as an administrator, but as someone passing a torch. "Don't just play to be admired," she told Emily. "Play so that no one ever forgets your name." In the car, Emily sat next to her father. She didn't say much. She just held his hand. Her old violin sat between them, resting in a new case. But inside it still bore the same scratches. She had never polished them, because each scratch marked a moment she had stood back up. On the first flight of her life, Emily looked out the window, where layers of clouds stacked like long hidden dreams now finally parting to make way. She didn't think of herself as a prodigy. She didn't think she was special. She was just a girl who once stood on a stage beside her janitor father, dreaming of a melody no one wanted to hear. But today she had made the whole world listen. She was no longer just the janitor's daughter. She was Emily Carter. And for the first time in her life, that name was called, not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but because she deserved it.